Welcome. I am Megan Reilly Cayten of Oceans 2050, where I lead a project focused on creating a new voluntary carbon market for seaweed farming. I'm the moderator today for the excellent lineup of speakers and panelists talking about carbon capture and removal from the perspective of nature-based solutions. We have with us today experts in carbon removal in soil and oceans, one of the world's leading climate scientists and fantastic entrepreneurs, and I know it will be a great discussion. First, we will have a keynote talk from Brad Ack. Brad's conservation career has spanned 30 years in ecosystems from tropical forests, high deserts, and temperate rainforests to the global ocean. Brad has worked for both government and NGOs at senior levels, at the interface of science, policy, and economics, designing innovative approaches to complex environmental challenges. His extensive experience in the ocean space includes running the Oceans Program at World Wildlife Fund US and serving as head of the Americas for the Marine Stewardship Council. Brad currently serves as Executive Director and Chief Innovation Officer for Ocean Visions. Brad is on a mission to bring the oceans and the climate communities together. No small feat, and to identify and scale up quickly climate change mitigation solutions for the oceans. He has been a source of enlightenment and inspiration to me personally in my work at Oceans 2050, and I'm delighted to pass it over to Brad to share his compelling message with all of you.
Thank you, Megan. That was a lovely introduction, and good morning to you. Good afternoon to everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. The title of my talk, which hopefully the slides will be appearing on the screen shortly, is Reversing Climate Disruption and Ocean Decline. And I want to just dwell on the fact that these two things are intimately linked. You cannot heal the oceans without healing the climate, and we can't stop climate disruption without addressing the problem in the ocean. And fortunately, the second part of the title, using the oceans to, the power of the oceans to remove carbon. So I'm using a clicker that I've just clicked. Let's see if it works here to go to the next slide. Yes. So we start with the premise that the climate emergency is right now. It's not something that we're waiting for to happen 20, 30 years from now. The evidence mounts around us every day. I read yesterday about zombie fires above the Arctic Circle that are burning year-round in the peat. Basically, you can't look at the paper and not see evidence of this emergency that's all around us. And what many people don't realize is that, in fact, the oceans have suffered disproportionately so far from the climate emergency. We don't call it suffering. We often say the oceans have shielded humanity or they've absorbed much of the heat. But in fact, this has come at a great cost. Here's just a couple of small examples: the enormous and increasing in frequency bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef and pretty much every other coral, warm water corals in the world, and calving of large icebergs off of Antarctica and the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. So what we don't focus on sometimes, perhaps enough, is that there are two major causes of harm to the ocean that are both driven by too much carbon in the atmosphere. The first is thermal stress. Thermal stress, as you can see from the graphic on the screen, is basically the heating of the ocean. The oceans have absorbed an unfathomable amount of heat since we started pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's calculated to be heating at a rate of about 5 Hiroshima bomb equivalents of heat into the ocean, 5 Hiroshima bomb sized heat equivalents into the ocean every second of every minute of every hour of every day. That's how much heat we're pouring into the ocean. And of course, that is having a big impact. First, you've got sea level rise accelerating as a result of this. Intensifying marine heat waves. I mentioned the loss of coral reefs. A warmer ocean creates much more powerful storms as much more moisture comes up into the lower atmosphere. We've got this increased melting of sea ice, which actually affects the ocean environment in many ways. Deoxygenation, warmer water doesn't hold oxygen as well in the upper layers, and so we have visible signs of stress for marine organisms. we see actual changes in currents. And the one spot on this map in blue is actually melt of water off of Greenland, which is affecting the Atlantic overturning circulation, which actually controls weather in Europe. So this is something of grave concern. We see interrupted mixing in the layers of the ocean, and in fact, poleward migration of marine animals away from warming waters in the tropics. So this is a slow-moving natural disaster in the ocean, all caused by one thing: too much carbon in the atmosphere. And secondly, too much carbon in the ocean, because about 30% of all that CO2 is going directly into seawater, which is leading to ocean acidification. This is direct absorption of carbon dioxide into the water in very large scales. And you can see the red upward line is CO2 concentrations in the air, and the blue is the reduced pH of the ocean, which is leading to more acidity. Now, this affects the production of aquatic life. Any aquatic life that forms a shell is affected by this. So again, another slow-moving natural disaster with a host of unknowns. And I will just repeat, thermal stress and chemical stress, there's only one way that we turn these off in the oceans, and that is reducing overall concentrations of atmospheric CO2 and oceanic CO2. Both are important. If you just take it out of the atmosphere, the oceans will respire CO2 back into the atmosphere because they live in dynamic equilibrium. So we have to tackle both. And sadly, current action and policy to do this are wholly inadequate. And we all know this. That's why we're here. That's why we get up every day and work on these issues. But the graphic on the left is basically a plot of international climate agreements, including obviously the Paris Agreement in 2016, with basically against rising emissions. So these agreements have done nothing to slow down emissions. In fact, they've intensified. The graphic on the right is from the statistical review of world energy put out by none other than BP, and it shows greenhouse gas emissions continuing to rise, investments in fossil fuels continuing to rise, and an enormous dependence on fossil energy. And an average annual growth in CO2 emissions over the last few years greater than the 10-year average. So our current climate plan is failing. Secondly, we're aimed at a target that I would argue is dangerously unsafe, this 1.5 target. And I know people say that it's science. It's actually political science. It's not science. Scientists will tell you, as you can see in the graphic on the right, that we're already at unsafe global temperature increases, and that as we inch up, it gets more and more unsafe. So 1.5 is just less dangerous than 2, but it is still dangerous. And it's also obviously very dangerous for the oceans. And you'll see, if you can read the slide, some of the things across the bottom, like warm water corals, are already in the red at 1 degree. So the other part about the 1.5 target is we have this really unfortunate thing called feedback loops. They're perversely called positive feedback loops, but they're anything but positive. These are parts of the global system that, as they warm, actually contribute more to climate warming. So things like the loss of Arctic ice, which allows more absorption of heat into the Arctic Ocean rather than reflecting it into the atmosphere, which is actually responsible for about 30% of all the global heating so far. Also, the thawing or melting of the permafrost, which has the possibility of releasing very large amounts of methane and CO2. So as temperatures go up, these feedback loops start to contribute more to the problem, and they make the hill that we have to climb even bigger. And the 1.5 degree impacts on the oceans are potentially going to create irreversible change. So we need a new climate plan. We need a new climate plan for the ocean. We need a new climate plan for humanity. Currently, most of our focus is on number 1 in this graphic, which is decarbonizing. That's cutting the future emissions of carbon. absolutely important. We have to do it. We've been working on it for 45 years, haven't made a huge dent. We're poised to make rapid change, but at this point, we're too late to be able to rely just on that tool alone. So now we need to add what are called negative emissions, which is really just nothing more than the cleanup of legacy CO2 pollution. And then there's a third component I'm not going to get into today, which is ecosystem life support, which is we have to slow down those tipping points. But let's just talk about the first two for the moment. So decarbonization, I've already mentioned, is going to require unprecedented transformations. These are words from the IPCC report on a 1.5 target. They require rapid and far-reaching transitions. The International Energy Agency had a report just this week that said we'd need to essentially start shutting down all coal-fired power plants and not building any new ones right away to achieve this target. And that's clearly not happening. So that's where we need to move to Plan B, adding it to Plan A, which is cleaning up this legacy of pollution. And I would posit that this legacy of pollution is like a Superfund site, which is a U.S. program to clean up long-lived toxins that have accumulated in the biosphere. Again, from the 1.5 report of the IPCC, they have shown that all pathways that will limit global warming to 1.5 require removing very large amounts of carbon, in addition to reducing emissions. Going beyond a 1.5 target will require even more. Now, here's where we get to the carbon, the role of the ocean in carbon capture and storage. The ocean already cycles enormous quantities of carbon, and it has the capacity to do more, basically by employing biomimicry and geomimicry, essentially accelerating, accentuating, and emphasizing some of the things the ocean already does. There are a number of different ocean-based pathways, from what we call biotic, which are plant-based, either macroalgae or microalgae, to abiotic, which are things that are more industrial, like dissolving alkaline or silicate materials into the oceans. We at Ocean Visions have been working on a series of roadmaps, technology roadmaps for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, because basically this area has remained very underinvested as a pathway for carbon removal relative to terrestrial approaches like planting trees or biochar or BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And so to address this sort of lack of investment and lack of awareness, we've convened experts over the past year from across the globe to really understand what are the ocean-based carbon dioxide removal technologies that are available, what are the current states of technological readiness, and what is needed in order to move these fields forward. We looked at three big domains that you see there in the middle of the screen: macroalgae cultivation and sequestration, so that's seaweed; ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is putting alkaline material into the water in order to interact with CO2 in the seawater and actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere; and then electrochemical approaches, which is using electricity, needs to be renewable, to separate carbon dioxide, carbon ions out of seawater. We also looked at two additional cross-cutting themes: growing and maintaining public support, because we greatly lack public awareness and support for the importance of this area, and expanding finance and investment. You can see these maps at oceanvisions.org. This is what they look like. They're designed to be very interactive. So when you click on one, right now only macroalgae is up. You will see this graphic, which shows you basically the technological readiness, the obstacles, the development needs, and in that lower left corner, what we call the first order priorities. And these are the things that we are galvanizing effort and attention around. And so this is just a click into the first order priorities. These are actually renamed. They're more specific now, but basically we are working to get more an array of controlled field trials across the globe on growing and sinking seaweed. We're working to build and maintain public support, and we're working really hard to unlock more investment. So I would encourage you to visit this. And also there's going to be, as we add functionality here in the next days and weeks, a way to actually become an authorized user, to be part of a community that is working on key pieces of these roadmaps. And so we're really excited about this product. We're really excited about the possibilities and potential for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts. We cannot solve the climate crisis without addressing the crisis in the ocean, and we cannot solve the ocean crisis without addressing the climate crisis. Cleaning up carbon dioxide removal has to become part of the agenda, and we have to expand greatly our attention to cleaning up carbon dioxide removal, and the oceans can play an enormous role in all of this. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining today. Please reach out to me through the platform, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you, Brad, for that call to action and for your leadership. It is now my pleasure to introduce the three speakers on our panel. Henrietta Moon is the CEO and co-founder of Carbo, a carbon technology startup drawing down atmospheric carbon. The company has developed a technology to rapidly transform woody biomass into a stable form carbon called Biochar, which will stay out of the atmosphere for 1,000 years. She's a Finnish serial impact entrepreneur, an alumni of the StartX founder community, a sailor, and a camper. David Duccini has spent more than 30 years focused on environmental issues in the water sector and now leads Origins.earth, the company created by Suez to help communities monitor their CO2 emissions in space and time with precision and to implement projects to reduce emissions. He described his work to me as from science to clients, which works well in this panel as our next member is a world-leading scientist. Philippe Ciais is a globally recognized expert on the terrestrial carbon cycle and its interactions with the climate and human systems. He has authored more than 900 publications with a focus on the quantification and understanding of CO2 emissions. He contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 4th assessment report, which won the Nobel Prize, and was lead author of a chapter on carbon and other biogeochemical cycles in the IPCC's 5th assessment report. Welcome all. And to start, I would like to ask each of you to briefly introduce your work and tell us what aspect of the climate crisis you are most focused on. Let's start with Henrietta.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm very honored to be on this panel with such esteemed members. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carbo. And at Carbo, we make a new type of biochar. So what is biochar? It's a biological carbon. And what we do is we turn waste woody materials into carbon in a very high temperature. And in that way, when we carbonize the biomass, it remains stable, it won't rot, it won't decay, and it won't be eaten by microbes, and it'll remain out of the atmosphere for 1,000 years. And then that biocarbon can be used for useful applications such as soil enhancement or nutrient management. And so excited to be here today. I'm Finnish, but I'm calling in from London, and nice to see everybody. And which part of the problem? We're focused, of course, on the carbon cycle, so actual physical removal of carbon from the atmosphere. But in addition to that, we're also looking at other planetary systems and where we can be of help there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Henrietta. And I've just been informed, actually, Philippe is not able to join us. So we have Henrietta and David with us today.
He's here.
I think I'm here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You can see me, but hello.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll work on that and let's move to David next. So David, please tell us a little bit more about your work than we learned in the bio in the introduction and what aspect of the climate crisis you're focused on.
Yeah, thank you. Such as you said, science to client. In fact, we realize that there is a lot that has been done with the scientific world since the last decades, but there is not enough that is used by the decision makers to be sure that we do the right choice and then we go fast and well in what we have to achieve. So Origins decided to focus on this, to be able to arrive, to move from the estimation and the estimation in CO2 and topogenic emission to a real measure. To do this, at the end of the day, what we try to focus is a digital twin at the city level to be sure that combining together physical measurement, data analytics, and modeling and inversing modeling atmospheric one, we arrive to have a global pictures of what are the anthropogenic emission of the city and to support the city to fight against this problem of reduction it. Important bridge, Origins can go nowhere if there is not in contact with science, and so I'm very pleased that Philippe is with us today, because we want really to maximize for the use of the decision makers what is the best production of the scientific world in the different continents. That is Origins.
Can we move to Philippe? I gather we may have only audio.
Yeah, I tried to switch on my camera, but okay, now you can see me. Hello. So I've been working mainly as a researcher to understand the fate of fossil CO2 emissions, which has been produced by humanity, because part of it is the main source of climate change, but another part, actually about half of the amount of carbon which is emitted by human activities, is reabsorbed by the vegetation and by the ocean. So it's extremely important to understand what are the regions which are pumping CO2 from the atmosphere, what are the processes by which this absorption occur, and how long will it last in the future. And more recently, I've been working more on the side of emissions with the setup of a near real-time monitoring system to estimate daily CO2 emissions, especially during the COVID period. And we've been doing some work at city scale to help use atmospheric concentration measurements in order to quantify how emissions are varying at the scale of a large city. We do that in collaboration with our colleagues and partners from Origins.
Fantastic. Well, we're thrilled to have you all with us today. And I wanted to start with a question for the panel. We have seen trends in the voluntary carbon market and in corporate net zero commitments that favor carbon removal over avoided emissions, and perhaps favor engineered solutions like machines that suck carbon out of the air over nature-based solutions. How can we leverage nature to meet climate change goals, and why is it important? So let's start with Philippe.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we should not forget that today nature is already offering us a 50% discount on climate change, because nature is absorbing on average about half of the emissions. So the question is, how can we make it additional? And the main technologies which have been proposed, at least by economists in the IPCC, is to produce biofuels and to take the CO2 out of the stack of a power plant and to bury it in the earth crust. This is very futuristic because we don't even have pilots for this technology. The second one has been to say, okay, let's plant trees or plant forests to increase the carbon storage. But we are living in a climate which is changing rapidly, which is very different from the climate we lived in only 10 years ago, which means that we are facing with carbon offset related to forest, the risk of losing the carbon we are trying to store if we face a disaster event like fires or windstorms or drought. So the carbon offsetting problem, or the carbon additionality of carbon sinks, we have to find something which is very long-lived, which can stay on the ground for a very long time. That's why I kind of appreciate the biochar idea, because compared to other more like temporary storage techniques, in principle, if you put charcoal in the ground, it's going to stay there for a long time, and it's not very harmful for other type of land uses as well.
Henrietta, do you want to chime in?
Yes, I think these are so excellent points, what Philippe said. I think for me, the biggest thing was, as we were entrepreneurs and trying to figure out how can we help this climate crisis, is that what is the most elegant way to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere today? And we were thinking about, okay, well, nature is already doing this today at gigaton scale. So why should we reinvent the wheel? So to say, instead of trying to imagine machines capturing parts per million out of the atmosphere, we've outsourced that part to biomass, which does it every day, completely 100% solar powered, without any additional energy use. And so it's such a massive scale machinery or leverage that we should totally not discount when we're talking about climate change action. And I think I can just concur with everything that was said already.
David, I know that Origins.earth is focused in part on cities, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on the role that nature can play to address this challenge from a city perspective.
I need just to do a short comparison to explain what is my mind. You know, they say that Italian people, they like to speak a lot about food, and it is true. And as I'm Italian, I will take how to build and to do a cake. Let me say that the cake is a tiramisu, if you like it, just to visualize. And to me, it is clear then when you do a cake that you have three elements that you have to take into account. First of all, it doesn't exist a recipe with a single ingredient. So this is number one. No way to use just one single ingredient. Number two is that you need to arrive to well know each one of your ingredients if you want to achieve your result. And so it is important that for each one of the components you are able to estimate what is the characteristic, the behavior, the impact, the difficulty, the right time to be used. And the third one is arrive to have a very clear understanding of what is the interaction of the different elements one with the other together, because when you mix together, the physical of the exercise change. So let me say now, if I go back again to the story of the planet and I do a comparison, if you do your tiramisu and your tiramisu is no good, you throw it away. You lose some eggs, you lose some carbon, some cream and mascarpone, but you can do again. With the planet, we cannot play. It's not a joke. It's a serious game, and so we need to work very properly. So we are convinced, strongly convinced, that the right approach is arrived to measure each one of the single action. Either will be nature-based, engineering-based, or reduction of emission that has to be the priority. We need to understand the contribution of each one of that. And to do the contribution, we have tools. The tools is called to measure what is going on. And if you arrive to measure, you can arrive to learn from the past. So you learn what was already done in the proper way. You control what is going on in the present, and you will forecast the future. So to me, the real truth and the solution is not one to have a position, but is to find the right recipe to achieve a global result, knowing what is the contribution of each single element. So there is place in the city, there is place in the country, there is place in the sea. What is important is to build the right recipe in different geography.
Well put, and I like the tiramisu analogy. The planet definitely is not as disposable. Not that I would argue the tiramisu should be disposable either. Well, building on your point about the importance of data, we know that for nature-based solutions to have integrity, which there's a lot of conversation about today, and to have market access, it's really important that we have efficient and reliable ways to quantify carbon stocks, to measure, monitor, report, and verify greenhouse gas data. Each of you has expertise in precise data measurement and in technology. And I'm curious if you could share a promising technology or perhaps identify an important area where additional research and innovation is necessary for our audience, some of whom are tech entrepreneurs, in order to move forward on this nature-based solutions carbon data question. And I'll start again with Philippe, and certainly encourage you all to make this a conversation and raise your hand if I can see you. I'll make sure that we call on you. Please go ahead, Philippe.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I think indeed the credibility of the natural climate solutions will in the end hinge upon the capacity we have to monitor their effectiveness over time. And this is sometimes a very complicated problem, in particular when you try to look at how soil carbon increases over time, because there is a lot of soil carbon already, and we are looking at relatively slow changes over time. In terms of emissions, I think what is really important is to see the signal in the atmosphere. I only believe what I see, and if you see that the kind of accumulation of CO2 upwind of an emitting source, whatever it is, a power plant or a city, is decreasing over time, then you know that this source is getting effectively reduced. The problem is that we can apply atmospheric measurements for hotspot sources, but it's difficult to apply them for project level carbon sequestrations because the signals of CO2 removals are too weak to leave an imprint on the atmosphere. And I believe a lot in the use of satellite imagery Now we have a lot of satellites. Some of them are very high resolution. And for instance, we are working on algorithms that can segment every trees, looking at satellite photographs. So we can track carbon, not on a kind of forest area or color basis, but on an individual tree basis. And there you really discover, how trees exist, grow, where they are present. For instance, in Denmark, we found that there are many trees in urban and peri-urban landscapes that were not classified as forests. So I really trust that very high resolution satellite imagery can help us, at least for nature-based solution, looking at forest or vegetation.
I can also add something from our solution. I don't know other solutions as well, but for us, when we produce the biocarbon, we know exactly what's in the biomass. So for example, walnut shells that we use, we can measure the weight of the biomass, the moisture content. We know exactly what comes out. In a laboratory scale, we can go to the percentage level information of how much of the resulting biocarbon is fixed carbon, how much is, for example, ash and different minerals, and how much is something else. So we can actually physically hold the carbon in our hand. I should have one jar next to me somewhere, and we can weigh it and we can send it to a laboratory to know exactly how much carbon is there. So it's very quantifiable in that way.
Hello, Philippe.
Then of course what humans do with it, or what humans do with a forest is more tricky to measure.
David, please chime in. It's your area of expertise.
Yeah. You spoke about which axis we see. I see three axes. The first one, and Philippe was very clear, is a satellite. For natural base, we need to use this technology for large scale, but to zoom in small detail. And this is what is necessary to take action. The second one is what we decided to work on, because as was repeated several times this morning during the day, cities represent less than 2% of the planet's surface, but the contribution is nearly 70% of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions. So for us, cities is a priority if we want to achieve a consistent result. And to work and to measure on the cities, such as was clear again in the word of Philippe, we need, to me, is the right word is to arrive to build the digital twin. Digital twin means that really you arrive to represent what is going on at the city scale, and it is a combination of the physical measurement that you have to put at the right elevation to be sure that you measure in not influenced local way. You need to use as much as possible the millions and billions of data that cities have, so we arrive to develop algorithms that are able to provide a very clear insights of what are the anthropogenic emissions that are coming out of the human activity. And together with the measure, we inject in the modeling, and with this, we arrive really to reproduce what is going on at the level of the cities. And to me, this is a must-have for all the cities that want to achieve consistent result. But there is a third axe, a third one that I think research has to work on, that is the local project impact. Because if we want to build a solid bridge between the measure and the finance, climate finance, we need to arrive to prove, measure, and certify what is the achievement that were consolidated with a single project. So really, to drive the city policy, I think digital twin is the right word. But to bridge with climate finance, we need to arrive much more in detail and to arrive to measure, estimate, and certify what is the measure at the project level.
And
this
I
is
think
the three axes that I see.
If I can add something, so one of the questions that you had is what should be done in more capacity to actually answer these questions of how we can measure things. And for example, in our area, there are many emissions that are still completely unknown. And for example, in Europe, there's a large problem with nutrient management. We have way too many nutrients running off from the fields, and not just into water, but also airborne pollution is being made by those. And airborne pollution is quite difficult to measure, or it's actually quite costly. So at least for us, measuring, for example, what kind of soil conditions are there, what kind of weather conditions, what kind of inputs can we do, and what are the results of those. It requires a lot of trials, a lot of computation, a lot of people work, and so that's kind of areas where I would like to see more things happening and more funding, for example, from governments, and so that we could get a more comprehensive idea of again, like the quality of those measurements needs to be high so that we can actually get to the solutions that are going to help us. And so there's a lot of work to be done in biology as well, not just in computation on estimates and what we think are the kind of baselines today.
No, I think it's fascinating. I work in oceans, and I work with a number of oceanographers who have ceased being scientists to be policy advocates because they've decided that we know enough about the science and people aren't doing anything about it. But it's important to understand that we need to keep advancing these scientific understandings and improving the accessibility and efficiency of technology so that we can make real-time decisions based on real-time data. Well, I think an interesting question we heard earlier today from Brad about just the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with respect to the oceans. It's obviously similar with respect to the land. And I'd be curious, we've got now just 3 minutes left, but I'd be curious to hear from each of you, what are the technologies that you see or the opportunities that could provide that massive scale that we need in terms of nature-based solutions, delivering real carbon removal benefits for the atmosphere, but also perhaps the other value that nature brings that is not solely measured in carbon. Sometimes when we optimize for carbon, we make mistakes in other areas. So I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit to scale. So Henrietta, for example, what is the scale of that a biochar solution could deliver, and certainly to Philippe and David, what they're working on?
Yeah, so biochar has, in various research, has been said to be able to reach a 0.5 gigaton to 2 gigaton scale. So let's say it could reach 1. We'll probably need 10 other solutions that would get to that kind of a scale within the next decade. So it's really not about one solution, like the tiramisu example was brought up. But I do think that there's a lot to do that we can do with natural carbon sequestration in biomass, and how do we put that carbon away once the biomass has actually brought that carbon down. So either by thinking of how do we get the calorific value out of the biomass out, for example, for food first, and then use it for locking away the carbon, or perhaps in the future, if we can free up some land or restore land where we can actually grow fast-growing biomass to actually start locking away carbon. There's different kinds of solutions that we need to look at, and we're trying to learn as we go and try to figure out how to get there. First, we're of course trying to just get our own technology and team up to scale before we need to even go past just agricultural biomasses that are already in hundreds of millions of tons available annually.
Philippe, do you have a perspective on the solutions, the nature-based solutions that to you offer the most promising scale?
Well, I want to make a comment first that today, vegetation and soils altogether, they absorb between 2 and 3 billion tons of carbon a year. And if you make the inventory of all the voluntary projects related to forest plantations, today, it's estimated to sequester an additional 0.02 billion tons of carbon per year. So we are clearly at 2% of the global natural kind of sink service. So it shows us that those solutions would need to be scaled up quantitatively at a very large extent. And my take on that is that I think the best thing is really to reduce the positive emissions, right? Because if you cut harder and steeper the fossil emissions, maybe it's possible to stay within the goal of the Paris Agreement. If you pile up all natural-based solutions, it's a wedge. It can help us do maybe 1/3 of the road to Paris, but the other 2/3 have to be done by cutting down fossil CO2 emissions. We will not avoid that.
And I'm sorry we're at time, but I want to give David the last word. So a quick response, please.
Now the quick response is once again fully online with Philippe, in the sense that we saw together that we have to work in emission reduction, and we saw with the COVID study in Paris that it's possible to achieve result. So I think we need to accept the fact, but let me say to end in the right way, that we have to change now our lifestyle and to adapt to reduce the emission, and then the rest we can compensate with natural based, engineering based, but it will be a combined action. Will be not again one solution giving the solution to all.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for that excellent discussion. I agree. The scientific advisor where I work often says there are no low-hanging gigatons. So I think we would all agree. We now turn to our last event of this session, which is a fireside chat with Paul Liu. Paul is a tropical agronomist who has worked in the field in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, and in a number of roles with the government of France focused on agriculture in overseas territories and relations with multilateral institutions. He was instrumental in the founding of the CGIAR, an institution dedicated to agricultural research for the benefit of the poorest people on the planet. In his current role, he is executive secretary of what is called in English the 4x1000 initiative, Soils for Food Security and Climate. Paul prefers to call it 4 per mille. And to start, Paul, I would love it if you could share with us what is 4 per mille, why do you prefer to call it that in English, and how did your life experience lead you to come to lead it?
Thank you very much, Megan. Yes, I prefer to call it that way because in English it seems to me that people never said 100 per 100. They said 100%. So, well, it's just a matter of understanding, and if people like to call it 4 per mille, well, very good of that. Yes, to start first, I would like to just recall what happened in at the beginning of my career. I was very interested at that time about all environmental issue in developing countries and agroforestry. And I remember that I wanted to start a PhD on agroforestry, and I met several very important persons, and those persons just tried to dissuade me from going down this pathway, telling that there will be no future for such a subject in my career. And well, fortunately, even though I was almost taken for a fool at that time, I can see that 40 years ago from that time, agroforestry is a major subject, and everybody is talking about everyone is talking about it. So I'm quite pleased to have continue in that way, and that today I'm able to provide, well, my modest knowledge to that initiative, and that is why 5 years ago I decided to join the initiative. So this initiative was created at the COP21 in Paris, the UNFCCC COP, and the objective of the initiative was to try to put human beings in a win-win-win situation. Well, we all know, and it was already said before, better than I will ever do, that it's important to reduce all our emission in the atmosphere, but we have also to use all the way we can use to try to remove this carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it somewhere. So the idea was to sequester the carbon in the planet's soils by using the photosynthesis mechanism through the plant, and using agriculture, that because we need to eat every day, so using agriculture to pump this CO2 from the atmosphere and put it back in the soil was the whole idea of the initiative. And doing that, we could improve food security, we could help agriculture to adapt to the ongoing climate change, and also we can contribute the maximum possible to the mitigation of climate change. So that's a win-win-win situation. And doing that, we will use soil, place soil health at the center, and use the capacity of soil done by farmers and foresters.
I'm sorry, I think we have an internet connection challenge. You said use the capacity of soil. Could you start from there?
Yes, and using the farmers to do that. I'm very sorry, my connection is very bad where I am. I am in the countryside.
Well, it makes sense. There's a lot of soil there. And what does 4 per mil mean? What do the numbers mean?
Well, the number is a back of the envelope calculation telling that if you compare the quantity of carbon already present in the soil and the quantity we release every year in the atmosphere due to human activities, then if we want to increase by 0.4% the quantity of carbon in the soil, then we could be able to, well, theoretically, compensate the emission. It doesn't mean that we have to continue to pollute, but it means that we need to reduce first and then also use agriculture to reduce the atmosphere CO2. And so the 0.4% is a kind of hope that we can do something. 0.4%, 4 per mil is very small. It seems to be small, and it gives hope that we can do something.
It certainly speaks to the scale of the potential solution, which is phenomenal. To your point, 0.4% doesn't sound like a lot. So I'll ask the obvious next question is, how do we actually do this? How do we increase soil carbon by relying on farmers? And what are the implications for example, farmer productivity and revenue? Does doing things in a slower and less extractive way mean we have to sacrifice returns or farmer livelihood, for example, and how long would that transition take?
Well, first of all, last year we just adopted a strategy 2050 for the initiative, and the vision of the strategy was and is worldwide healthy and carbon-rich soils to combat climate change and end hunger. So we consider that this is really a very powerful tool. What we all want to do behind this initiative and with this initiative is to have the maximum of people involved in the paradigm shift of world agriculture towards agriculture that is fully in line with agroecology. That's really the reason for this initiative. And we need all the people to be involved, not only farmers. Farmers will be the one doing the work in the field, but we need to have the decision maker, we need to have the company, the NGOs, the scientists, everybody on board, because they will all contribute to develop an environment that is favorable to this move towards agroecology. And this move towards agroecology means that we need to use less mineral fertilizer, less agrochemical, and in the same time having more carbon sequestration in soil and increased biodiversity, which is the wish of our society today. And to do so, the farmers can choose one of the category of agriculture that are along the continuum, which is the agroecology, like, for instance, conservation agriculture, like holistic grazing management, biodynamic agriculture, organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, biochar, it was mentioned before. And they need to find their own way to take their place in the whole work that we're going to do together. And they also have to cope with their soils and climate where they are. So if we consider that, and considering, for instance, conservation agriculture will lead to no-till, a rotation of crops, and also cover crops. That means that the farmers will have less expenses, less charges, when they will consume less diesel for the tractor, for the plowing, because you are no more plowing in your field, and you will use less fertilizer, less agrochemical. So while the revenue will still remain the same after a few years of transition, and so there will be less time of work, less labor time, less charges, more revenue, or at least the same. So it means that the productivity of the farmers will remain the same at the end, and also the farmers will have a better living. We need to keep in consideration that specific aspects of farmers having a better living, because they are the one doing the job, and we need to recognize that.
It's so important to put the farmers first and at the center of all this. I noticed that when you were talking about solutions, you didn't use the term regenerative agriculture, perhaps because It's a term under some debate at the moment and is being used in a variety of ways by different people. I would be curious from your perspective, is it a useful term? Would you use it to apply to the kind of agriculture you're encouraging farmers to undertake? And if so, what to you does it mean?
Yes, I use that word, and I use it carefully because I know what is the meaning behind that. I think, yes, you're right. This expression, regenerative agriculture, is coming on the table more often and is used by companies and some NGOs and a lot of people now. But the fact is that if FAO, for instance, at the international level, provide definition for a lot of categories of agriculture, even agroecology is defined by FAO, like conservation agriculture, organic agriculture, and so on. There is not yet a definition for regenerative agriculture. There are some possibilities, and we propose in the 4% initiative with our scientific and technical committee a definition for that regenerative agriculture, and we hope that this definition will be used by a majority of persons. But we need to understand that beyond practices, there are some general principles, and one of the general principles is that the soil and soil health is really at the center, and also that all the activity of agriculture is involving air, soil, water, and biodiversity, and need to regenerate all of those elements through the process of agriculture, which is important. We need also to understand that there is the search for the maximum autonomy in terms of input and raw material within the farm, and also placing the human being in the middle. So we need to consider not only economic aspect, but also socio-economic aspect, and having back in the farm the trees and the animals, not only the crops. So it means it's really an holistic approach, and it's a holistic definition which need to be understood by all the users.
You mentioned earlier that it's very important to think about the place where the farmers are, the local conditions, because obviously all these transitions will be based on the local environment. And I'm curious, given that your career has been so global and that you're based now in Europe and have lived all over the world, if you see that any particular geography on the planet has more potential to make this transition, both to support livelihoods and to support soil carbon enhancement, that any particular geography has more potential than another. Is there somewhere we should focus first?
Well, as we are relying on biology and the plant growth using the photosynthesis, of course, the humid tropical condition will be the most suitable for the development of biomass as a whole. But we do not have to neglect any area in the world. Even the dry land in tropical condition, or even in the Arctic condition, all need to be done in all those places to store maximum carbon in soil. And I would say, on the top of that, not only we need to act to increase the quantity of carbon in the soil, but we need also to do our maximum to decrease the losses and avoid losing carbon. And one of the major issue at the moment is that all the carbon we may lose through the permafrost melting due to the climate change. This is very important, and we have, well, unfortunately, there is no solution for that. There is a category of solution that could be implemented using animals and during the winter period, but you need to have a lot of animals in the place. It's just impossible to handle for human. But that will be a major issue, and really that's just to tell you that we cannot say that one place is more suitable. What is interesting is that we can, and encouraging also, is that we can see at the moment that everywhere on Earth, people are implementing methods that are able to store carbon in soil. Conservation agriculture, for instance, in Africa, in Latin America, in North America, in Australia, for instance, even in Asia, agroforestry system in most of humid tropic for cocoa, for coffee, but also for living of the farming, family farming system. And I would say mainly in Europe, we are a little bit behind, and we start thinking that it will be interesting to develop more activities. There are pioneer people that develop such conservation agriculture, for instance, and regenerative agriculture. But if you take the example of France, if you add organic agriculture and conservation agriculture, you can reach a maximum of 15 to 20% of all the area in France maximum, which is not a lot because we are one of the major agricultural country in Europe. So we need to do a lot, and of course forest can help also on the other end.
We talked a lot about increasing carbon content of soil, but I have learned from you about the importance of biodiversity in soil. So what other benefits might we get from making this agricultural transition?
Well, it's important to change our the way we are looking at soil. In fact, for a long period of time, I mean several decades, we consider the soil as a support, just an inert support for crops. And in fact, soil scientists told us already for a long time, but nobody were there, agronomists were not there to listen to them, that soil is also a living substrate. And this life in soil is very important for the life over the soil, on the top of the soil. And it's important to keep that biodiversity. Just, I like the idea that it was not my discovery, but I used that one. People said that a teaspoon of healthy soil contained more living organisms than human being on Earth. That just gives you an importance of the living soil. And it's also true that in the same teaspoon of soil, you can have 100 arthropods, you can have thousands of nematodes, millions of protozoa, and billions of bacteria, and 1 million of species. You have kilometers of fungi, mycelium, and so on. So we cannot imagine all the life in a small quantity of soil. And so if you put that at the level of the scale of the global planet, so you will see that it is so very important. And all this life condition the life above the soil, and it means plant, it means animals, and of course it means human being. So that is why we need to be very careful about this life, this biodiversity in soils.
We've just got now 2 minutes left, and I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about what we mentioned earlier, putting farmers first, what we ask of farmers, and the potential. So we ask farmers to feed us, but now we're asking them to save the world. How might they actually do that, and how can we support them?
Well, the first things we need to do is to stop blaming the farmers for their work. I mean, really, if there are people to blame, it's people like me, agronomists, that tell the farmers what to do, and we give them the recipe, but the problem is that we give them the wrong recipe. Well, it was maybe the right recipe at that time, but it's no more the right recipe. We need to change that definitely, and we need to support the farmers. To be clear and to reestablish a truth, the farmers will not save the planet. The thing is that the planet doesn't need human being to exist. If humanity disappeared tomorrow, the planet will still be there and will continue to evolve. So our issue is to save the humanity on the planet. So that's really important. And the role of farmers is very important in that. And we need to recognize what they are doing. We need to recognize that we need to pay the proper price for all the product we are purchasing from them. Not only covering the cost, the production cost, but also allowing the farmers for his family or her family to have a proper, decent standard of living. And we need also, in addition, to grant them with an additional premium for environmental services rendered to society. We need to pay for all of that. And at the end, they are the ones who are working the work of storing carbon in the soil and to fight for climate change. So we need to thank them for doing that job and allowing us to be there tomorrow. So let's remember that what I said and what you said, that this is probably the farmers who will save the humanity on our planet.
That is a fantastic message to end with. Thank you, Paul. To all our speakers and panelists for this excellent and thought-provoking session. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and we'll leave today with a deeper appreciation for the role of nature in carbon-based sinks and the role of nature in general in providing a home for humanity, and how we can better support all of those who are leading the way to restore both nature and the climate. Thank you all.